Hello and welcome to episode 18 of the Talking Central Banks podcast with me, Karan Medici. This platform is exclusively dedicated to everything central banking, monetary economics, and policy technicals for observers across the world. Today, we have a very special episode as we will be chronicling a central bank's response in managing a war economy. In this context, we will be taking lessons from the experiences of the Ukrainian Central Bank, which in turn has been managing a war economy for over 3 years now. Our guest tonight is Kyrylo Shevchenko, who was the governor of the National Bank of Ukraine between 2020 and 22. Before he became the governor of the Ukrainian Central Bank, Kyrylo was the chairman of the managing board and CEO of Ukraine's Joint Stock Bank, or GSB. Previously, he was the chairman of the executive board of the Terra Bank between 2010 and 12. He also served as the advisor to the Prime Minister of Ukraine and was the chairman of Ukraine's state mortgage agency. Kyrylo holds an MA in law from Ukraine's National Academy of Internal Affairs and an MA in accounting and business analysis from the Kharkiv State Economic University. Due to his security concerns, Kyrylo will not join us live for this show, but he has provided us with his written responses. With the use of special AI-powered speech tools, we have given Kyrylo's responses a voice, giving the audience an uninterrupted and pure account of how things unfolded at the Ukrainian Central Bank as the war raged on and things became difficult for the economy. So without further ado, let's begin. Kyrylo, please share your experiences in managing the monetary policy in Ukraine during the crisis period, especially with regard to new challenges that emerged very quickly and left almost no time for adequate policy response.
When the war started on the 24th of February 22, the country had neither a scenario nor political signals nor a clear decision-making framework. But the National Bank had to be ready, regardless of whether the political leadership acknowledged the threat or chose to downplay it. Our task was clear: to prevent a collapse of the financial system, to hold the hryvnia, and to preserve confidence. We began preparations for a potential wartime scenario even before the start of the full-scale invasion. At the end of 21, the risk was already obvious from the standpoint of macroeconomics, logistics, and intelligence. But the president and his team deliberately kept the threat quiet. This put state institutions in a paradoxical situation, as preparations were needed, but there was no political mandate. Therefore, the National Bank started preparing on its own, without public statements, not thanks to, but in spite of the position of the president's office, which was to maintain political silence. We deployed an internal action plan. We conducted liquidity stress testing of banks using deposit outflow models of 10 to 30%. We updated the business continuity plan, or BCP, for critical processes, i.e., payments, reserves, and communications. We relocated part of the IT infrastructure and data centers to Western Ukraine, created backup nodes and autonomous power supply. We created a cash buffer to support an uninterrupted cash-in-transit cycle, even in the event of blocked central vaults. We also prepared a package of wartime regime regulations that could be launched within hours after the invasion. Precisely because of this, on the 24th of February at 5 a.m., when it became clear that the war had begun, we already had a full architecture of decisions, and we were able to act immediately. That same morning, Resolution Number 18 was adopted. It became the financial constitution of wartime and remains in force today in its fundamental parts. The resolution established a fixed exchange rate of 29.25 UAH per US dollar to stabilize expectations, full capital and FX controls, and a ban on capital outflows, unlimited refinancing for banks against government securities, a moratorium on penalties and fees for borrowers, guaranteed continuity of the payment system, a ban on capital flight, and other measures. On the same day, the NBU opened a special multi-currency account to raise funds to support the armed forces of Ukraine. We did not wait for political approvals. The account was opened by the decision of the board, and the first inflows started within hours. In the first days, Ukrainians and foreign donors transferred over 7 billion hryvnias, which became an unprecedented example of financial mobilization of society. By the time I left office, as of 1st October 22, the account had received over 21 billion Ukrainian hryvnias in total. These funds were promptly converted and directed to defense needs, medical procurements, and humanitarian programs. The NBU ensured full transparency, i.e., daily reports on inflows and spending were published on the bank's website. In parallel, we worked with the IMF. Already on the 6th of March 2022, in record time, i.e., less than 2 weeks after the start of the war, Ukraine signed with the IMF an emergency financing arrangement under the Rapid Financing Instrument, or RFI. And symbolically, the document carried only 2 signatures, the Minister of Finance and mine as NBU governor. There was no signature of the President or the Prime Minister. This meant that the IMF trusted not the politicians, but the professionals who were actually managing the financial system at the moment of total chaos. The RFI program provided Ukraine with the first emergency financing from the fund, i.e. $1.4 billion, just 10 days after the start of the war. This international support became the key marker for all subsequent financial assistance to Ukraine and demonstrated the country's institutional capacity. Thanks to these actions, the system held. In the first 48 hours, more than 15 million transactions went through the NBU's electronic payment system, and all key banks operated without interruptions. Within 3 weeks, over 140 billion hryvnias in refinancing had been provided, and no systemically important bank stopped operations. Retail deposit outflows did not exceed 6% in March 22 and stabilized as early as April 22. After that, banks' deposit portfolios showed steady growth. In parallel, we built direct communication lines with the International Monetary Fund, European Central Bank, Bank of England, and the National Bank of Poland. Through the NBU's technical accounts, more than $10 billion of international support passed in 22, from donors, financial institutions, and partner governments. The Ukrainian Central Bank essentially became the financing hub for the state. The National Bank of Ukraine prepared the financial system not thanks to, but despite the political leadership. While the president was denying the reality of war, the NBU team was building mechanisms for the survival of the state's financial system. Thanks to this, the hryvnia remained a currency of trust, the banks remained operational, and the NBU remained the institution that was trusted even when the state was losing control over part of its territory.
Did the central bank adopt any unconventional tools to stabilize the exchange rate and prevent capital outflows? It is apparent that businesses, households, and foreign investors were extremely sensitive to military escalation, and investors were reluctant to invest in local currency denominated assets. It seemed that policy rate changes might not be effective in such an environment. Please elaborate.
Businesses, households, and foreign investors were extremely sensitive to military escalation, and investors were reluctant to invest in UAH-denominated assets. It seemed that policy rate changes might not be effective in such an environment. After the start of the full-scale war, FX policy stopped being classical. The market no longer existed in its usual form, but the currency, the banks, and expectations had to be held. Therefore, in the first days, the National Bank switched to a regime of full FX control, not to restrict freedom, but to preserve the state's financial manageability. The first decision was to introduce an administrative model of FX market management. FX purchases for most import operations were banned, capital transfers abroad were suspended, and non-resident investment operations were blocked. FX purchases were allowed only for critical needs: energy, medicines, food, and defense-related goods. To make the mechanism more transparent, the NBU proposed that the government form an official list of critical imports that would reduce pressure on the exchange rate and the external trade balance. The idea worked as long as its implementation remained technocratic. Once the formation of the list came under the government's control, the economic logic was lost. In the summer of 22, items began to appear on this list that had nothing to do with critical needs, including sherry and Madeira. After that, I acknowledged that the mechanism had been discredited, and the NBU agreed to abolish it. This became an illustration of a simple truth. When political populism replaces economic logic, the instrument loses its meaning. The second step was to fix the official exchange rate at 29.25 UAH per USD. This was an anti-panic, not a purely monetary decision. It gave society an anchor that the hryvnia was not falling and that the state remained financially controlled. The fixed rate became the psychological anchor on which confidence in the financial system rested. To understand the effect, we should look at the dynamics of the NBU's FX interventions. 2022, about $25.3 billion. 2023, $36.8 billion US dollars. 2024, $34.6 billion US dollars. In the most critical year, i.e., 2022, when the markets practically didn't exist, interventions were the lowest. That is, the effectiveness of 22 monetary policy is measured not in money, but in the ratio of outcome to resource. The fixed rate, strict control, and clear communication made it possible to maintain stability with the lowest possible spending of reserves. In the first 3 months of the war, net FX sales reached $5.4 billion, $2.0 billion in March-April, and $3.4 billion in May. At the same time, international reserves remained at around 25 to 26 billion US dollars, which provided more than 3 months of imports. This showed that FX stabilization was achieved not through depletion of reserves, but through confidence. One of the most unusual but effective steps was the restriction on displaying FX rates on exchange office boards. This decision was based on the logic of behavioral economics. People react less to macro indicators and more to visual stimuli. When everyone saw 40 to 42 UAH per USD on street boards, panic multiplied regardless of the real situation. We removed that signal, leaving the rate only in banks' internal systems. The market perceived it as an oddity, but the psychological effect was immediate. Demand for cash FX fell, and the panic spiral stopped. This is an example of a behavioral instrument delivering a macroeconomic result. The set of decisions made by the National Bank in the first months of the war was unconventional, and exactly for that reason, effective. We stopped the panic, stabilized the currency, and ensured the economy's defensive capacity. The year 2022 proved that, in wartime, the best monetary policy is not soft, but strict, clear, controlled, and understandable to the market. When the state speaks the same language as the system, it doesn't need to burn reserves to prove it is strong, and that is strength.
In your speech on the 2nd of June 22, which was not only your first public address after the start of the full-scale war, but also the first monetary policy decision made during the war, you mentioned, Kyrylo, that the insufficient yield of hryvnia assets was increasing the risk of dollarization and the loss of financial resources for the banking system. Consequently, the National Bank increased its foreign currency sales interventions, that is about $2 billion in March, April, and $3.4 billion in May 22. What was your experience in ensuring higher yields on hryvnia assets, and how did you balance between interest rates and reserves?
The first public communication of the NBU regarding the start of the war took place on the morning of the 24th of February 2022, when the governor and the board of the National Bank of Ukraine recorded an official video statement. Звернення голови та правління Національного банку України, 24th of February 2022. In it, the bank announced the introduction of Resolution Number 18, the fixation of the exchange rate, FX restrictions, and the uninterrupted operation of the banking system. The speech on the 2nd of June 2022 became the first monetary policy decision after the start of the war, the moment when the NBU returned to active management of the hryvnia's yield and market expectations. Even before the policy rate hike, the NBU had adopted a strategic monetary policy framework for wartime. On the 15th of April 2022, the NBU Council approved the document Fundamentals of Monetary Policy for the Period of Martial Law, available at bank.gov.ua, which defined three key goals. 1. Ensuring the stability of the banking system. 2. Maintaining a controlled exchange rate. 3. Preserving confidence in the hryvnia as the national currency. This framework guided all subsequent decisions on the policy rate, foreign exchange interventions, and liquidity management. In March-April 2022, the volume of NBU FX sales amounted to about $2 billion, and in May, $3.4 billion. The low yield on hryvnia instruments, an average of 6 to 8% per annum with inflation above 16%, encouraged dollarization. The share of FX deposits reached 37% of total deposits, while weekly demand for cash FX exceeded $1.3 billion. Without changing the monetary parameters, reserves could have fallen below $20 billion by midsummer 2022. Decisive action was required to prevent this. On June 2, 2022, the NBU raised the key policy rate from 10% to 25%, i.e. by 15 percentage points, the largest one-time increase in the bank's history. The purpose of this step was to restore positive real yields on hryvnia assets, retain deposits, raise government bond yields, and reduce speculative demand for foreign currency. In essence, this marked a transition from a crisis fixed-rate regime to a policy of managed financial equilibrium. The reaction of the financial market confirmed the correctness of the step. After the rate hike, the average term deposit rate increased from 6.9% in May to 11.5% in July and 13.2% in August 2022. Yields on NBU certificates of deposit rose to 23 to 24%, which balanced short-term bank liquidity. Yields on war bonds reached 19 to 20% per annum, creating a domestic investment instrument in hryvnia. The volume of hryvnia deposits grew from 543 billion hryvnias in May to 571 billion hryvnias in August, while the share of FX deposits fell by more than 3 percentage points. Average monthly FX interventions fell from $2.7 billion March to May to $1.2 billion in July to August. The rate increase produced a visible macroeconomic effect. International reserves stabilized at around $25 to $26 billion and rose to $28 billion by year-end. Inflation, which exceeded 18% in May, declined to 15.9% in September and to 14.4% in December. The spread between the official and cash FX rates narrowed from 15 to 17% in June to below 10% in October. Public expectations improved. The share of citizens expecting a depreciation of more than 10% fell from 62% to 38%, according to NBU surveys. Raising the key rate to 25% became a turning point. It demonstrated that even in wartime, the NBU retained the ability to conduct independent monetary policy based on macroeconomic logic rather than administrative control. The combination of three decisions: adoption of the fundamentals of monetary policy, 15th April 2022, the June rate hike, and transparent communication, ensured stability of the hryvnia, reduced dollarization, and maintained reserves at a level sufficient to finance imports and sustain exchange rate stability.
In July 22, the National Bank adjusted the official exchange rate of the hryvnia from 29.25 to 36.6 per US dollar, stating that this step would help support the competitiveness of the Ukraine exporters and stabilize the economy. Please explain the logic behind this decision, Kyrylo, as impact on inflation, imports, and the balance of payments.
From 24th February 2022, the official rate had been fixed at the pre-war level of 29.25 UAH per USD, which initially stabilized the market. However, by April-May, the gap between the official and the actual market rate had reached 15 to 20%. This distorted incentives, as importers were buying FX cheaply, exporters were reluctant to sell, and reserves were shrinking. Between March and May 2022, FX sales exceeded 5.4 billion US dollars. Therefore, on 21st July 2022, the NBU adjusted the official exchange rate to 36.6 UAH per USD to achieve several objectives. Eliminate the gap between the official and the market rate, support exporters through higher hryvnia, proceeds that curb speculative FX demand, reduce the need for large-scale interventions. This decision was a logical continuation of the June rate hike, aligning monetary and FX policy under a consistent framework. Earlier, on the 15th of April 2022, the NBU Council had approved the fundamentals of monetary policy during martial law, which legitimized both the June rate hike and the July rate adjustment. After the correction, it became more profitable to sell FX, and the volume of NBU interventions declined sharply. If in May the bank sold 3.4 billion US dollars, then by August the figure had dropped to 1.2 billion US dollars, 3 times less. International reserves stabilized at around 25 to 26 billion US dollars and began to grow gradually, reaching 28 billion US dollars by the end of the year. The current account turned positive in H2 2022, around plus 2.5 billion US dollars, due to higher grain exports after the opening of the grain corridor. The adjustment had a short-term inflationary effect. Inflation rose to 22.2% in August, but then started declining, 20.8% in October and 14.4% in December 2022. In 2023, it continued to fall to 5.1% in December 2023, the lowest level in a decade. This disinflation was the direct result of 2 synchronized decisions, the June rate hike and the July exchange rate correction. The rate anchored expectations, and the new rate restored external balance, easing pressure on reserves and the FX market. The correction made imports more expensive in hryvnia terms, but it reduced their volume and thus eased FX outflows. In H2 2022, imports declined by 17% compared to H1, while the share of critical imports rose to 72% of total imports. Hence, the market adapted to the new rate without losing access to energy, fuel, or medicines. Both decisions, the June rate increase and the July FX adjustment, became the core anti-crisis instruments. Together, they restored a realistic equilibrium between the price of money and the price of currency, rebuilt confidence in monetary policy, and set the foundation for the lowest inflation in the wartime period.
In the second half of 22, Kyrylo, despite high inflation and general uncertainty, the hryvnia exchange rate remained stable. How did the National Bank manage to preserve confidence in the national currency under such extreme conditions?
At the start of the second half of 2022, Ukraine faced a highly atypical macroeconomic mix. Inflation had already exceeded 20%, GDP had contracted by nearly 30%, part of exports was blocked, and by March-May, the NBU had already sold more than 5.4 billion US dollars to cover FX shortages. After the July correction, the official rate was fixed at 36.6 UAH per USD. In almost any other country, this combination would have triggered a sharp depreciation. That it did not happen in Ukraine was not an accident, but the result of a coherent policy sequence. By August 2022, three key measures were already in place and did not contradict each other: a fixed exchange rate, a high key rate, 25%, and wartime FX restrictions on imports, capital, and payments. This created something rare in wartime: policy consistency. When the exchange rate, interest rate, and regulatory regime all point in the same direction, speculation becomes much harder. After the rate hike, banks began to attract hryvnia deposits back into the system. The volume of retail deposits grew from about 543 billion hryvnias in May to over 570 billion hryvnias in August. This meant that the hryvnia was not flowing out of banks into the FX market. It was being saved and redeposited. At the same time, NBU certificates of deposit at 23 to 24% absorbed excess liquidity, preventing pressure on the exchange rate. After the July correction to 36.6, monthly FX interventions fell by nearly half, to 1.0 to 1.3 billion US dollars. That was a powerful market signal. If the NBU was not burning 3 to 4 billion USD monthly, it meant it had enough strength to hold the rate. Reserves remained within 25 to 28 billion US dollars, enough to cover more than 3 months of imports, a strong position for a wartime economy. Communication was another key instrument. Throughout 2022, the NBU switched to a regime of radical transparency, publishing intervention data, explaining FX restrictions, and even clarifying why exchange rates had been removed from street boards. This clarity created predictability. When people understand what the central bank is doing and why, they buy less FX just in case. Meanwhile, quiet channels were also working. The NBU continued to secure IMF, EU, and donor support through its own accounts, a signal that foreign inflows would continue. Why did the rate hold despite 20% plus inflation? Because inflation was high but controlled. After peaking at 22% in August-September 2022, it fell to around 14 to 15% by year end. When inflation moves down and the exchange rate stands still, it creates a sense of stability, even at high price levels. Confidence was maintained not because there were no problems, but because each problem was met with a visible instrument: the rate, the peg, restrictions, or interventions. Stability of the hryvnia in H2 2022 was therefore not a coincidence. It was the result of a well-designed mix: a fixed rate, high interest rates, strict FX controls, and sufficient reserves, not market calm, but strategic management. The NBU removed the ability to speculate against the currency and simultaneously offered real tools in hryvnia, deposits, government bonds, and certificates, giving people reasons to hold the national currency.
How did Ukraine manage to ensure the import of energy and critical materials during a period when the national currency was under strong depreciation pressure? And what was the situation with other import categories such as food and consumer goods?
At the moment of the invasion on 24 February 2022, Ukraine effectively lost a large part of its export revenue but not its import needs. In the first weeks, the main challenge was to secure uninterrupted supplies of energy, fuel, medicines, food, and military logistics. For that reason, the NBU and the Cabinet of Ministers simultaneously introduced a list of critical imports, the only mechanism that allowed the use of FX reserves strictly for essential imports. The decision worked effectively during the first months. FX was sold only under contracts for defined categories: energy, medicine, food, defense, which helped stabilize the exchange rate without uncontrolled reserve depletion. At the same time, the government centralized procurement of gas, petroleum products, and electricity using international aid resources. The problem arose later when the government began to expand the list of critical goods to include non-essential items, undermining the mechanism and again increasing demand for FX. In 2022, a significant share of NBU FX interventions, over $25 billion US, effectively acted as an energy buffer. Through FX sales, banks financed imports of fuel, LNG, electricity, spare parts, and defense equipment. Thus, reserves did not merely stabilize the rate, they literally kept the energy system running. This was one reason why GDP contraction began to slow in H2 2022. The economy did not shut down due to energy shortages. Food supplies, grain, oil, meat, sugar, remained stable since Ukraine had a domestic surplus, but imports of consumer goods, clothing, household electronics, vehicles, dropped by nearly 60% in 2022. That eased FX pressure, but limited retail recovery. After the reopening of the grain corridor and partial restoration of logistics in 2023, imports began to grow faster than exports, creating a structural trade deficit, which by 2025 reached a projected $52 billion US. Thus, maintaining energy and critical imports was one of the main reasons why Ukraine's macro-financial system survived in 2022. It was, in essence, a controlled redistribution of FX reserves toward vital sectors. However, this model cannot be permanent. Financing imports through reserves and external aid is a short-term anti-crisis measure, not a sustainable policy. In the medium term, external balance can only be restored through growth of energy-intensive and value-added exports. Otherwise, Ukraine will remain energy-supplied but macro-financially vulnerable.
Kyrylo, the NBU launched 8 anti-crisis measures to maintain banking sector stability. How did they help to preserve the system's resilience, in your opinion?
From the first day of the war, the NBU's goal was not merely to keep the banking system solvent, it was to ensure that it never stopped functioning, even for a single day. Anti-crisis decisions were made under emergency response logic, monetary, regulatory, and technical measures all at once. Our strategic principle was clear. Banks must operate even under fire. The 8 measures were built around that principle. 1. A moratorium on capital outflows and dividend repatriation to prevent FX leakage abroad. 2. Guaranteed cash supply to banks and the public. The NBU established regional cash logistics hubs, including in frontline areas. 3. Uninterrupted operation of the electronic payment system, EPS, zero downtime throughout 2022, ensuring continuity for business and fiscal payments. 4. Eased liquidity requirements. Banks were allowed to use reserves without penalties to meet clients' payments. 5. Access to refinancing. The NBU opened special credit lines for banks that had lost part of their assets due to hostilities. 6. Temporary regulatory relief. Relaxed capital and provisioning rules for loans in war-affected regions. 7. Administrative FX restrictions, prioritization of government payments, limits on FX purchases by individuals, and oversight of FX operations. 8. Limits on cash withdrawals, capped withdrawals to prevent bank runs. These measures achieved the essential objective. Public confidence in the banking system was not lost. Even at the peak of panic in March 2022, the share of deposits withdrawn from the system did not exceed 5%. By year-end, retail hryvnia deposits had grown from 543 billion Ukrainian hryvnias to 570 billion Ukrainian hryvnias, and the share of liquid assets in banks exceeded regulatory norms twofold. The NBU maintained daily communication with banks and the public through briefings, circulars, and publication of FX intervention data. This created a sense of predictability even amid chaos. People knew the system was working and that their money had not disappeared. The anti-crisis measures were therefore not only technical but also psychological instruments. They reduced panic, maintained liquidity, and prevented a banking crisis at the very moment when it seemed inevitable. Given the scale of economic losses in 2022, this can, without exaggeration, be considered the most successful financial defense operation in Ukraine's modern history.
According to the latest financial stability report, Kyrylo, while the share of non-performing loans spiked in 22, only about 4% of loans actually became non-performing in 24. How did the NBU manage to restore economic activity over the past 2 years? Also, Kyrylo, how do you explain the U-shaped recovery in retail lending in Ukraine?
After February 2022, credit activity almost completely stopped. Banks functioned solely in a liquidity support mode, processing payments but not taking new risks. In war zones, up to 60% of loan portfolios became technically non-performing, and the NPL ratio rose to 37% by mid-2022. At that stage, the NBU's main task was to maintain a balance between liquidity and trust, to keep banks from mechanically cutting credit lines. Thanks to stabilization of the exchange rate, declining inflation, and the high key rate that restored confidence in hryvnia assets, lending began to recover in the second half of 2023. Banks gradually resumed business lending under state guarantees and the 5 to 7 to 9% concessional program. At the same time, the NBU introduced flexible approaches to risk assessment for borrowers in frontline regions. This reduced the formal NPL ratio and encouraged restructuring rather than write-offs. Why did the NPL ratio drop to 4% in 2024? First, because of the rebound in economic activity. Real GDP grew by over 5% in 2023, enabling banks to recover debt servicing. Second, restructuring. Part of legacy loans was extended at longer maturities and lower rates. Third, the quality of new loans improved. Financing was extended only to clients with clear cash flow capacity. The result is not a credit boom, but a gradual normalization, which is far healthier for the system. The U-shaped recovery in retail lending has a simple explanation. Consumer demand disappeared instantly in 2022, but it recovered faster than corporate demand because households adapt more quickly to risk. After the collapse of 2022, retail lending began to grow in H2 2023, first through auto loans and POS financing, later through consumer loans. By mid-2024, the retail portfolio had grown by nearly 30%, creating the characteristic U-shaped trajectory. The success lies not merely in the return of credit, but in the fact that banks remained liquid and well-capitalized, without any recapitalization from the state. Regulatory flexibility, prudent risk control, and the absence of political pressure on lending allowed the market to heal organically. The evolution of credit dynamics shows an example of systemic adaptation. The market moved from shock to stability without administrative intervention. This is perhaps the main achievement. The Ukrainian banking system not only survived the shock of war, but restored its ability to lend while remaining financially self-sufficient.
Kyrylo, Ukraine's international reserves grew significantly in 2023 despite the ongoing war. What were the main factors behind this increase, and how sustainable is this dynamic given the structure of external support and domestic policy?
The rise in reserves in 2023 was not the result of improved trade performance or export recovery. It stemmed primarily from an unprecedented inflow of external financing. During that year, Ukraine received over $40 billion in total international assistance, a mix of grants, concessional loans, EU macro-financial support, U.S. budgetary aid, and funding from the World Bank and the IMF. These inflows allowed the government to finance budget expenditures, while the NBU simultaneously accumulated foreign exchange. In other words, reserves increased not because Ukraine earned FX, but because it was provided by donors. Yet this growth is structurally fragile. The main component of reserves today is external aid, not export proceeds. Meanwhile, the external sector balance has deteriorated sharply, The trade deficit in goods and services reached $22.9 billion in 2023, $31.8 billion in 2024, and is projected at about $52 billion in 2025, according to the NBU. This means the country systematically consumes more foreign exchange than it earns, and the reserves simply cover that gap. The mechanics are straightforward. Donor dollars enter the system, are credited to NBU reserves, part of them is sold on the interbank market to cover fiscal and import payments, and the NBU sterilizes the excess hryvnia liquidity through deposit certificates. Essentially, external aid is converted into domestic liquidity and then withdrawn again, a circular process. I have often said publicly, almost the entire money supply today is effectively backed by donor inflows, while FX demand is driven not by export needs, but by domestic consumption. Since 2023, imports have been growing faster than exports, driven by energy, defense procurement, equipment, and pharmaceuticals. By July 2025, imports of goods and services had reached $51.05 billion, while exports totaled only $26.53 billion, creating a 7-month deficit of $24.5 billion. This is not a market fluctuation. It is a structural imbalance that can only be offset by continuous external transfers. As a result, any delay or temporary suspension of donor funding leads immediately to a drawdown of reserves. The current model is inherently unsustainable, as it assumes that donor inflows will remain stable and predictable. Ukraine effectively operates on two treasuries, a tax one and a donor one. If the second is delayed, a currency crisis follows almost instantly. Today's reserves are therefore not an accumulated surplus, but a contingency buffer, insurance against disruptions in donor financing. They represent time, not strength. Without external aid, Ukraine's FX market would not withstand even a single quarter. To mitigate this risk, several steps are essential. Reduce non-critical imports and return to a transparent list of truly essential goods. Move toward a more market-based exchange rate to lessen the scale of interventions and promote self-regulation. Limit the fiscal use of FX reserves under the pretext of rate stability. Otherwise, even reserves of $43 to $45 billion as of mid-2025 could decline by $3 to $4 billion per month during peak import periods. Reserves are not a symbol of strength when they are donor-built rather than market-earned. The central question is not how large they are, but why they exist, and what happens when the source stops.
You previously described the current exchange rate regime as managed flexibility that has gradually turned into manual control. What exactly did you mean by that, and what should be the NBU's path toward a more sustainable model of exchange rate formation?
Formally, Ukraine has operated under a regime of managed flexibility since 2023. In reality, however, this is a tightly controlled exchange rate, determined not by market forces, but by the national bank through daily interventions and administrative restrictions. There is no true equilibrium between FX demand and supply, only regulator decisions about when and how much currency to sell. This is not monetary stability, it is communication-based stability. When the market is not allowed to fluctuate, the exchange rate ceases to serve as an economic safety valve. Any FX shortage, whether due to rising imports, seasonal factors, or delays in donor inflows, is absorbed directly by reserves. The market cannot react because it is not permitted to. Each episode of rate holding therefore costs billions of dollars in interventions. This model is politically convenient but economically expensive, and we have already seen this before. From 2010 to 2013, the official rate of 8 Ukrainian hryvnias per US dollar was presented as a symbol of stability. In reality, it was artificial. The NBU was selling FX to defend the 8, while reserves fell from over 30 billion US dollars to below 16 billion US dollars by late 2013. When external financing stopped, the rate collapsed, and the country suffered a threefold devaluation. The situation today is almost a mirror image. The official rate hovers around 39 UAH per USD. Reserves exceed 40 billion USD, but their source is the same: donor inflows, not market revenues. The only difference is political context. Back then, the fixed rate was politically beneficial to the Yanukovych regime. Now it is politically convenient for the Zelensky administration, for whom any exchange rate fluctuation is deemed unacceptable amid wartime. The risk, however, is identical: another deferred adjustment that could erupt abruptly once support inflows slow down. That is why I advocate a gradual return to a genuinely floating exchange rate, guided by transparent and pre-announced rules for interventions. Such a transition would include allowing the exchange rate to be set by interbank market demand and supply, the NBU intervening only to smooth excessive volatility, not to define the level, publishing a clear formula for interventions. For example, smoothing daily changes exceeding plus or minus 1.5%. Tightening import discipline while easing administrative limits for exporters. A floating rate does not mean chaos. It means restoring the thermometer of the economy, which has been artificially switched off. And just as in 2015, a controlled liberalization would not weaken the system, but strengthen its credibility. To avoid sharp shocks, the transition should be phased. First, widening the FX corridor around the current level. Next, gradually reducing the volume of NBU interventions. And finally, introducing transparent intervention triggers tied to volatility thresholds. A floating rate is a policy of honesty. It shows the real balance of the economy instead of hiding imbalances behind administrative calm. Only in this way can the market begin to self-correct rather than rely on the central bank as a permanent price setter.
In 24, the NBU began to signal its readiness to move toward a more flexible exchange rate. In your view, Kyrylo, what actual conditions are needed for such a transition, and what could go wrong if it is done prematurely?
In just the first 7 months of 2025, Ukraine's accumulated trade deficit already exceeded 27 billion US dollars. In the July 2025 forecast, the National Bank projected the annual trade deficit at around 52 billion US dollars, the worst figure in the entire history of observations. These numbers explain why I insist on moving to a floating exchange rate. The current managed flexibility model in fact means manual exchange rate maintenance through NBU interventions. The market does not form the price of the hryvnia. The regulator does, executing a political task of stability for the current administration. Imports are being financed from reserves, not exports. With such a gap between FX demand and supply, no flexibility actually works. Only daily FX sales do. When a country consumes more than it produces, the exchange rate must reflect that. Moving to a floating regime should be done now, while reserves still exist, not when the street boards once again show a rate no one expected. What conditions are needed? 1. Sufficient FX reserves to cushion the first months of volatility. A transition always creates additional demand for FX. The NBU must have a buffer to smooth spikes without losing control. 2. Predictable external financing. If donor inflows are irregular, a move to floating can be misread by the market as the NBU is out of FX, which would provoke even higher demand. Third, balanced import policy. As long as the country is importing everything and anything, the entire burden falls on the exchange rate. A return to a clear list of essential imports would reduce pressure during the transition. 4. Transparent intervention rules. The market must understand when the NBU will step in, not to defend a level, but to limit daily volatility. What can go wrong? If the transition starts when external inflows are delayed, the market will view it as a forced step and will test the NBU's limits. If the government simultaneously maintains a large fiscal deficit, part of this deficit will immediately spill over into the FX market. If communication is vague, businesses will hedge for safety, which will amplify demand. So the issue is not whether to move to a more flexible regime. It is how to do it without burning reserves and without creating a political crisis over the exchange rate. The honest answer is, the current model is already burning reserves, just quietly. A phased float would at least make the price of the hryvnia an economic, not a political, variable.
Given Ukraine's current level of reliance on external budget financing, how do you assess the sustainability of this fiscal model? And what are the main macroeconomic risks if external support is reduced?
By the end of 2024, over 60% of all budget expenditures were covered by external sources, including grants, loans, and EU macro-financial assistance. In other words, 6 out of every 10 hryvnias in the budget came from abroad. This is an unprecedented level of dependence, not only for Ukraine, but for any country that is not under a formal international administration. There are several systemic risks here. Risk 1, cash flow risk. The system has no internal buffer. If external financing does not disappear but is merely delayed by a few weeks, the country immediately faces a cash gap. The domestic government bond market cannot cover a deficit measured in tens of billions of dollars, so the only fire exit becomes the national bank again. Risk 2, FX risk. Any reduction or delay in external inflows is instantly transformed into pressure on the FX market. When grant or loan dollars do not arrive, the government still continues to finance imports and social payments. But now, it is the NBU that must sell reserves to provide FX. As a result, reserves fall and depreciation expectations rise, even without any change in fundamentals. Risk 3, monetary risk. If such a gap persists, the government starts looking for a shortcut: monetary financing. We already saw this in 2022. The NBU's purchase of military bonds was a temporary solution which, had it not been phased out, would have turned into a full-scale inflationary threat. Today, direct emission is not being used, but the structural pressure on the NBU remains, especially when the budget again plans a deficit of over 1.5 trillion hryvnias. Risk 4, interest rate risk. External support allows Ukraine to borrow cheaply. If it shrinks, the government will have to borrow domestically and at much higher rates. Rising domestic yields on government bonds will pull up lending rates and slow down both investment and consumption. This is the classic crowding out of the private sector by the state, only on wartime steroids. Risk 5, donor confidence. This is the key one. Donors are paying now because they see control and coordination through the IMF and the EU. But if Ukraine starts to close gaps with its own methods, hidden emission, non-transparent FX restrictions, politically motivated exchange rate decisions, confidence will drop quickly. Then the circle closes. Less confidence, fewer disbursements, more FX pressure, even less confidence. Genuine fiscal sustainability will begin only when the budget can finance the bulk of its expenditures from its own revenues, and not from borrowed trust.
Kyrylo, you introduced the term donornomics to describe Ukraine's current economic model. Could you please explain what you mean by this concept and how this model affects the country's macro-financial stability in the medium term?
When I first used the term donornomics, I was not describing just a financing setup. I was describing a new type of dependency in which a country's economic policy is determined not by exports or tax revenues, but by the schedule of external assistance. Ukraine today operates in a mode where the budget, the exchange rate, and the reserves depend on donor decisions, not on the dynamics of domestic production or trade. This is not an accusation, it is a statement of fact. A country at war has no other source of resources. About 60% of the budget is covered by external funds, the rest by domestic taxes. Donors supply the FX, the national bank sells it on the interbank market, ensuring exchange rate stability and fiscal financing. On paper, this looks like a stable system. In reality, it is an artificially supported equilibrium where the main stabilizer is not the economy, but foreign confidence. I wrote in my column that Donornomics is an economy where the price of the hryvnia is determined not by production, but by the speed of transfers from Brussels and Washington. That is why this model saves the country and distorts its market mechanisms at the same time. Donornomics allowed Ukraine to survive the war. Without this financial frame, there would have been no military salaries, no stable hryvnia, and no functioning balance of payments. The problem begins when a temporary mechanism becomes permanent policy. When donor dollars replace export FX, and the rate is maintained not by the market, but by interventions, the economy gradually loses its ability to self-regulate. Donornomics also has a less visible but very important side: loss of policy agency. When half of the budget is financed by donors, the government and the NBU start to live in an external signal mode. What the EU will say, how the IMF will react, when the next tranche will arrive. This creates a temptation to shift domestic political responsibility onto partners. We saw this clearly in recent months, when public stories appeared that the IMF is pressuring Ukraine to weaken the hryvnia. Such statements are a typical symptom of donornomics. Instead of an internal debate on economic rationality, a convenient explanation, "This is the fund's demand," is created. This is no longer just economic dependence. This is the delegation of political responsibility for monetary decisions. Donornomics saved the country during the war. Now we must make sure it does not become the country's post-war fate.
Some Ukrainian officials claim that IMF programs ensure macroeconomic discipline and investor confidence, while the others say that they limit the country's sovereignty. What is your position in this debate?
The IMF is, first of all, about credibility. In a wartime economy, the IMF program is the only anchor that keeps the country from macroeconomic chaos. Each disbursement is a signal to other partners that Ukraine is following rules, is not monetizing the deficit, and remains predictable. Yes, the fund imposes constraints, but this is not a loss of sovereignty. It is a safeguard against domestic political irresponsibility. The problem is not with the IMF. The problem is that the authorities too often hide behind the IMF, explaining their own decisions with the phrase, "This is the fund's requirement." In reality, the IMF does not take away our will. It creates a framework in which this will make sense. After the war, this credibility will be more valuable than any tranche.
In your view, Kyrylo, what economic model should Ukraine build after the war in order to ensure sustainable growth and reduce dependence on external donors?
I have my own vision of this model. It will be the central topic of the book I am finalizing now. But in short, Ukraine must use everything it already has: people, resources, intellect, energy, geographical and financial advantages, and learn to look further than politicians look. Sometimes that also means looking back, into history, however paradoxical that may sound. Unfortunately, in all the years of independence, Ukraine has never built a real economic strategy, only a set of short-term crisis reactions. Again and again, we substituted development policy with survival policy. Real state strength is born where there is long memory and long vision. Therefore, I am convinced Ukraine does not need another support model. It needs an economic philosophy based on its own history, responsibility, and confidence. Only then can the country not only endure, but actually determine its own future.
Many believe that after the war ends, foreign investors will quickly return to Ukraine. Do you share this enthusiasm, Kyrylo? Also, what conditions are needed to make Ukraine attractive for real long-term investment?
Expectations of investors lining up the day after the war ends are unrealistic. After the war, Ukraine will still face a trade deficit of over 50 billion US dollars, a large fiscal gap, and a structural reliance on external resources. In such conditions, private capital does not arrive by fact of peace. It arrives when the country demonstrates stability, predictability, and clear rules. Several preconditions are necessary for long-term capital. 1. Macro-financial stability. A predictable FX regime, gradual reduction of interventions, and moderate inflation. 2. Fiscal discipline. A budget deficit at levels that do not jeopardize debt dynamics, gradually down to 3% of GDP. 3. Reliable institutions, courts, tax system, and energy market operating without ad hoc political interference. 4. Predictable government policy. Less politics, more rules. If Ukraine genuinely intends to join the EU, it must also orient itself toward the Maastricht criteria, the minimum macro stability standards of the euro area. In particular, the general government deficit should not exceed 3% of GDP. Public debt should be below 60% of GDP or moving toward that level. Inflation should not be more than 1.5 percentage points above the average of the 3 best-performing EU members. Long-term interest rates should be within 2 percentage points of those same countries. These are not formalities. They are measures of trust. Investors assess the country in the same way the EU assesses a candidate, by its ability to fulfill commitments and maintain balance. That is why the path to investment recovery and the path to the EU are, in fact, the same road.
Finally, in your opinion, Keerylo, how has Ukraine's reputation among international financial institutions and investors changed during the war? And what factors will determine its credibility in the coming years?
During the war, Ukraine received an unprecedented moral and financial credit of trust. The world saw a society capable of resisting and keeping the economy functioning under shelling. This, the resilience of society, is the main source of our reputation. At the same time, international financial institutions are increasingly distinguishing between society and the model of governance. They respect the Ukrainian people, but they are cautious about the growing concentration of power, opaque communications, and the weakening of independent institutions. War cannot be a justification for authoritarianism in financial or economic decision-making. Ukraine's reputation rests on 3 pillars. 1. Integrity of statistics. NBU, Ministry of Finance and State Statistics data must be consistent and reliable. 2. Independence of the regulator. Decisions on the exchange rate, inflation, and reserves must be professional, not political. 3. Predictability. Partners must understand that tomorrow there will not be a different budget, a different tax system, or a different monetary regime. If these 3 elements are preserved, Ukraine will remain understandable and investable even after the war. If not, no loan or grant will compensate for a loss of trust because financial reputation, like a currency, depreciates very quickly.
Very interesting perspectives, Keerylo. Talking a bit about the the background of this episode and why this discussion is important at this time. Managing an economy during war is perhaps the most difficult task for any central bank across the world. This is because, as an institution of national prominence entrusted to manage the monetary side of things, a central bank has to perform multiple tasks to manage not only the domestic macro stability, but also currency and forex management. Technically, the trilemma disallows central banks to perform all these tasks simultaneously, but during war, there is no such excuses. Execution is therefore everything, and the central bank must deliver on all fronts. Previously, the US Fed has elaborated its experiences managing a war economy with numerous papers and presentations, especially pertaining to the management of World War II. Other central banks of prominence also have well-documented chronologies describing the events unfolding and actions taken to restore market confidence. Nevertheless, in the 21st century setting where information and data proliferation is at a different level altogether. Monetary management is perhaps a seemingly impossible task, and the experience of Ukraine National Bank chronicled for posterity. On that note, this is all I have for today. I am sure that this will be a highly informative episode for all of our audiences across the world. I would also like to thank Keerylo once again for taking out the time and sharing his thoughts and experiences on this century's most pivotal monetary management exercise. Thanks once again, Keerylo, and thank you all for watching.